lot of people have asked me, how do I know if my pilot jet is too big or too small? I have the perfect bike and the perfect carb to show that on. I have the Bonanza bike that's been sitting around here for months. So this bike pretty much has a stock DuroMax 208. The only thing that's done to it is a header pipe and a Tillotson 212E flywheel. And then it's running this Max Torque 10-tooth racing clutch with a 60 sprocket on the back, so a 6-to-1 ratio. And then right now, it doesn't have a carb on it. I did have a slide carb on here, but I do have the perfect carb for this bike. I have this VM22 over here. And this is one of the VM22 kits that cost, I think, 22 or 23 bucks on Amazon. So we got the air filter, the intake, comes with a fuel filter, and all the hoses and stuff, and gaskets. And we got the carb. So definitely worth 22 or 23 bucks. Oh, and it has the hardware in here. But the only thing with these carbs, they come with very small jetting, even for a 208. I think it probably has a 95 or a 92 main jet. We'll find out. So I'm gonna throw the VM22 on the DuroMax 208, and then we'll check out the jetting and we'll see how far we're off. So these VM22 carbs have a fuel screw that's on the engine side of the slide, unlike say a PWK where they have an air screw, and the air screw is on the air filter side of the slide. So on the VM22 with the fuel screw, if the fuel screw is out more than 3 turns, then your pilot jet is too lean. And then on the opposite side of it, if your fuel screw is less than 1.5 turns out, then your pilot jet is too rich. So like I said, on the VM22, if your fuel screw is out more than 3 turns, then your pilot jet's too lean. But over here on the PWK, if the air screw is out more than 3 turns, then the pilot jet's too rich. So it's just opposite. And then if the air screw is out less than 1.5 turns, then the pilot jet is too lean. So everything's the opposite, going from the air screw to the fuel screw. And these settings are not set in stone. They just kind of give you an idea. I mean, if you start getting your fuel screw out there, like say 3.5, 4 turns, you have to turn it out that far, then your pilot jet is definitely too lean. So I mean, it's not exactly 3 turns, but when you start getting out there pretty far, then you know you got a lean pilot jet. So I've seen some people will take the intake manifold and then bolt it to the engine first, and then bolt on the carb. But you really shouldn't do that with a VM22 with one of these setups, because you have to have this carb and this intake aligned on this O-ring here. And if it's off, you can get an air leak between the intake and the carburetor, and there is no tuning the carb at that point. So you have to make sure that when you install this intake, you get this intake and carb in alignment. If you get it off like that, you possibly can create an air leak between the intake and the carb. And then another thing I've noticed with this setup, if you put the intake on the engine first and then bolt on the carb, on the outside, it can look like it's in alignment, but if you look down the carburetor, it's totally off. On the outside, it looks like it's in alignment, but it's actually not. So you definitely have to bolt the intake to the carburetor first and get it in alignment before you bolt it to the engine. Another thing I noticed some of these kits come with is an insulator to keep the carb cool. You definitely don't want this thing to vapor lock. You get a nice cool intake charge. So I have running this setup, these VM22 carbs, with the insulator or without the insulator. I mean, I've ran them both and they run fine up here because the weather is cool enough up here. But if you live in a super, super hot climate, it definitely might be worth it to run this insulator. So on these insulators, there's an O-ring on one side and then not on the other. So you have to make sure you get the O-ring on the right side, and then the flat side here goes up against the carb because the carb has an O-ring. Then they bolt together. So I got the intake on there and then the insulator, and I got the O-rings facing the correct way. So now I will bolt the intake and the carb to the engine, and then I'll turn the carb to where I need it, and then I'll take it back off and align the intake manifold with the carb. And sometimes I'll mark this just to make sure that I keep it where I want it, because when I'm messing with this intake and the carb trying to get it into alignment, sometimes I will forget where I needed to set the carb at. So anyway, there you go, that's pretty straight. So I got my intake and the carb in alignment. So now I'll go ahead and swap out that main jet, because these carbs come with a 95 main jet. So that is just too small for something like a Predator 212 or this 208. So let me swap that out. So I think I'll probably throw a 115 main in this for right now, because we live up here at 3,700 foot elevation and it's a smaller engine, and I've gotten away with 115s on many combos up here. And usually, like I said, these are 95 or so. We'll see. So this one is a 95. So let me throw a 115 back down in here. Definitely get it more into the ballpark. So let me pull this pilot out of here and we'll see what we have. Okay, it's really hard to see the markings on here, but they usually have around a 15 or so. So I'm just gonna try the stock pilot and we'll see, because a lot of times with the stock combos up here, I've gotten away with the stock pilot, so we'll find out. And like I said, as long as we don't have to turn the fuel screw more than 3 turns out, we'll know it's not too lean. Okay, let me see what we're starting out here. Check out this fuel screw. So I'm going to turn this all the way in, but I'm not going to turn it in too hard. Just a brass screw. There's one, and there's a half. So we'll start out about a 1.5, and we'll see what happens. And I already got the gasket on there, so go ahead and install this on here. So I got the fuel line hooked up, and the vent line's hooked up. So now I'll hook up this throttle, and I think it'll be pretty easy because I had a slide carb on here before, and I already soldered on a tip. And hopefully we get full throttle here. Oh yeah, that'll work. So now I'll fire this thing up and I'll adjust the fuel screw under here, and I'll turn the fuel screw out until we achieve the highest idle, where it's running its most efficient. And then I'll readjust the idle with the slide screw here. So let me fire it up and we'll see how it runs. Let it warm up for a while. So now I'll back the fuel screw out until it reaches its highest idle. So this one here achieved its highest idle at about a turn and a half out. So it's running its most efficient, and the pilot jet's in the ballpark. So now I'll start it up and I'll adjust this slide screw and turn the idle back down. And then I'll test the tip-in throttle response. And we'll see if it's responsive, and if it's not, I can richen up the mixture with the clip on the slide. So I think it's a little bit lean on the tip-in throttle response because it does hesitate a little bit. So now I'll pull that slide out and I'll move that clip down one to raise the needle up, and that should richen up that mixture a little bit. So I pull this slide out of here. So I'll pull this needle out of here, and you gotta be careful not to lose this clip. that'll go flying out. So now I will take this clip and I will drop it down one slot to lift the needle out of the jet, and there's no need to use needle nose pliers to get the clip off. You just put it on the table here and pop the clip off. Okay. All right, so there's the clip. So now I'll put it on the next slot down. Okay. Pop this needle back down in here. And then I make sure not to lose that little washer in there. There's a nylon washer in there. Put the clip back in here. Hopefully that richens it up enough. Okay, let's see what that does. Let's fire this thing up and we'll see what that does. So that definitely helped it out. It has no more tip-in throttle response hesitation. So it needed to be richened up just a little bit with the slide here, with the needle. So now the pilot jet or the fuel screw is set about 1.5 in the idle set, and then the tip-in throttle response is set. So now I'll go out and cruise it around to see if that main jet's close or somewhere in the ballpark, which I think it is, and then afterwards I can check the plug. And it gets the speed quick. Yeah, definitely could use some more gear. That's pretty much topped out right here. Definitely nice and snappy with this gear ratio. So it seems like it runs pretty decent with a 115 main, but I can pull the plug to make sure, and if it is running a little lean, I could pop a 120 in there, and then if I did, most likely I'd have to pull the slide back out and readjust that clip on that pin, because the tip-in throttle response might be different with a 120 main. But there's only one way to be sure, and that's to swap out the main jet and see how it runs.